Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Richard Sakwa to talk about his latest book. We will talk for about half an hour, and then I will throw the discussion open to questions from you. Could you please send them through the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your screens, and I will then pass them on to Richard. And I apologize in advance if I can't get around to everybody, because there are usually a great many questions. So thank you very much, Richard, for coming. Dr. Richard Sakwa is Emeritus Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. He is one of the leading analysts of Russian foreign policy, of the conflict in Ukraine, and of Russia's relations with the West, from what I think we now have to call in the West a dissident standpoint, somewhat in the old Soviet style, given the somewhat monolithic character of the establishment consensus here. Richard is the author of numerous leading books on these subjects, including Frontline Ukraine, 2015, Russia Against the Rest, and Deception, RussiaGate and the New Cold War, which came out last year. Today, we will chiefly be discussing his latest book, which was published this month by Yale University Press, The Lost Peace: How the West Failed to Prevent a New Cold War. So, Richard, welcome. I always feel, since we're both of a certain age, it's a rather terrifying thought that nobody under the age of 32 was even born when the last Cold War ended. And nobody under the age of about 45 has any clear memory of the 1990s, when rapprochement between Russia and the West seemed, well, both possible and desirable. And so I'd like to begin by asking, the obvious question. The high hopes of those days, which we both, others remember so well, were they always foredoomed to failure, in your view, or in fact, could the better and more stable relationship that we all believed was there in the early 90s, could that have been preserved?
Yeah. Can I just comment on your dissent comment first? Because it's funny, this. I've been thinking a lot in thinking about the book and about the lost opportunity, the idea that we could have a positive peace order in 1989 at the end of the First Cold War. At that time, that vision and into the early 1990s was indeed the consensus view. And I basically haven't changed my views in all these years. Obviously, the facts have changed and the format has changed, but ultimately the world itself, the consensus view, the way that the common sense of the age has shifted. And it's most alarming to me, the fact that this has happened, and this has meant that some of us are now considered dissidents, outsiders. And as for your substance of the question, whether there was an alternative, absolutely. Was it doomed? No. I do believe in agency, and more than that, in reflecting on these issues, it's also, and I don't want to be sententious or pompous about it, but almost in a sense that, we scholars, we perhaps even of the older generation, everyone has a duty not just to give up, not to say, look, that this negative piece is the way the world is, and just throw up our hands. That's not the case. And the real substantive point is, the underlying, if you like, to use a fancy term, the meta-narrative, the real key idea of the book, The Lost Peace, is that an alternative is possible. That this negative piece, as I call it there, this endless being always on the edge of war, Cold War, competition, struggle for primacy, hegemony, all of that, is contrasted with, a vision, a vision of a positive peace. Now, this positive peace is tough. It's not going to be easy. But if you have a sort of a vision of it, a more cooperative order, a sense of working together within the framework of the Charter International System established in 1945, the United Nations system, which I'm a great believer in. It's got its many, many flaws. We all know that. But it's the only thing we've got. We have to stick to it. So positive peace, really is, a lot of our colleagues across the so-called global south refer to this. We don't need this constant conflict. And this epicenter, the cockpit of it, of course, today is tragically Europe, where the failure to establish, one concrete manifestation of that would have been a pan-European, a pan-continental vision, a Gaullist, Gorbachevian common European home vision.
Gorbachev, I was about to say, who the people in the West so much admired, even to possibly to an exaggerated degree at the time, but of course more recently totally ignored his criticisms of later Western policies, including
Indeed.
NATO expansion.
The thing about Gorbachev is that, sadly he died just over a year ago, but it's even in his obituaries, they failed to understand the core of Gorbachev's thinking, what drove him to have perestroika reforms, putting an end to the Cold War. It was not capitulation to the West. That absolutely was not the idea of the new political thinking. What it really was an appeal to that universal principles embedded in the 1945 Charter System, the UN, as I said, all flawed. But those principles, after the end of the catastrophic Second World War, then the world said, never again, let's build a better world. And those principles still operate to this day. Unfortunately, we slid into the first Cold War, which then, of course, all sorts of other logics, geopolitical, dominated. We had this moment, 25 years of what I call the Cold Peace, before we slid into the second Cold War from 2014. So yet again, but still, we have to distinguish between the system, which is the Charter system, and various suborders within it, which is formerly the Soviet Union, today what I call the political West, which is the Atlantic power system.
I mean, to what extent is the problem rooted in the association, at least in the minds of so many Western analysts and politicians and commentators? I mean, going back, of course, to Immanuel Kant, the idea of the democratic peace, that you basically cannot have a stable and peaceful and cooperative relationship with a dictatorial system. Because at the time, of course, so many of the hopes attached to Gorbachev, but then also to Yeltsin, were to do with a possibly quite, well, I mean, certainly a fantastical and catastrophic association of radical free market reform with an extraordinarily rapid transition of Russia to full Western style democracy. And when that failed, there was a reaction which then associated what was happening inside Russia with Russian foreign policy. I see some of the same syndrome at work with China. We swung from a belief in a sort of almost miraculous democratization of the Chinese system, to demonization. How important was that in your view in the case of Russia in breaking down trust and cooperation?
It was the fundamental. At the end of the Cold War, two models of the post-Cold War peace order were on offer, both, relatively good, but different. The first one appealed, as I say, to the United Nations, and its functional motive was and is sovereign internationalism. That is, states of whatever sort, as long as they commit themselves to fundamentally the Charter idea, but they're still internationalists. They work together, multilateral. And so whether they're democracies or whether they're developmental dictatorships of one form or another, or other types of authoritarian systems, or Islamic theocracies, or whatever, that the world, and that's the whole point of the Charter international system, it allows this sort of pluralism. Of course, egregious human rights abuses are to be condemned. There's no question of that. But at the same time, the appeal shouldn't be we judging but the universal of principle of United Nations is the only real court to be dealing with this. Unfortunately, we had this alternative idea, which is democratic internationalism, the one you alluded to from Kant onwards, which basically says that everybody has to, be governed in the same sort of way. This sort of end of history ideology, which also dominated in the early years, that there's only that the history was tending in one way. It isn't. Civilizations are different, cultures are different. China, with you mentioned 5,000 years of civilizational identity. Of course, it will find its own path to modernity and its own relations between state and society. We may have our views, but it's not our right to impose our views unless, as I say, utterly egregious. I mean, then of course you have this issue of double standards, which of course is part of the operating mechanism. That's why I talk about the political West. This is a system which was born in the Cold War, which fought, the Vietnam War, which is highly militarized, militaristic even. And in the United States, we all know, the way that this extraordinarily powerful military-industrial complex, remember that communist Eisenhower who condemned it in his farewell address in 1961. Of course, other US leaders came to a different understanding, and I appeal in the book to John F. Kennedy, which I've been reading. His assassination was just a few days ago, 60 years ago. So really catastrophic, sad, and of course, Bobby Kennedy not long afterwards. So an alternative is possible. And if we can formulate it, and that's what I was beginning to do towards the end of the book and want to do in future work, formulate how to get towards a more positive peace order, which would include, of course, you mentioned, the European context, which was very important for Gorbachev, that we need more instead of this monolithic, I mean, it's not monolithic, but the strong unity of the political West to allow more voices to be heard in international affairs.
And how do you have any, can you tell us about ideas for basically getting out of the present mess in the long run? I mean, something I think that we're both very conscious of, which I fear a great many commentators are not really, is that history is a long business. In other words, and God knows, I mean, we've seen over the past 2 generations, I mean, so many unexpected events which have upended, previous expectations. So, I mean, obviously, this is going to be a hard struggle, and it will take time. But can you say more about how you think we could actually extricate ourselves from this Cold War into which we have now plunged?
Yeah. First of all, we have to have a belief in the sense that an alternative is possible, because, so in other words, the pessimism that has seized us. In the past, who would actually articulate the alternative? Of course, there was a socialist movement, which, of course, is all but as a powerful intervention at the moment, has almost gone. Cuba and some other countries remain, but basically, and who would articulate it? Some of the more radical liberation theology as well. But all of that is gone, which does leave us a rather devastated social space. But there are movements, and we can see this emerging now within the political West. It's far from monolithic, far from homogenous. And one of the ideas clearly overcoming that logic of geopolitics. So I think academics, public intellectuals play an important part on this in formulating a sense that a reduction simply to, realist, hard realist. I mean, foreign was I'm a realist, but as like you, I think ethically we have to be committed to a sense of justice in international affairs, and that's where the charter system, the UN Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights play an important part in all of this. But I insist. I think the geopolitics within the framework of the international system. Now one endless discussion is of multipolarity, that the salvation, if you like, of the West is coming from the global South. It's important to understand what we mean here. The age of decolonization perhaps continues at the margins, but it's over. We now live in a world of some 200 nation states. The state system has matured. We now need to really have a sense that there's more players. Of course, there's a big three: Russia, China, and the United States, and India, maybe big four. But and clearly there's that they size and economic importance does imbue countries with leadership responsibilities. China, by the way, of course, in all of its various latest initiatives, the strategic policy initiative, and even the peace plan for Ukraine was an important intervention. It wasn't a plan, but it was a statement of principles, which was important and perhaps provides a framework for a peace order. So we're beginning, in other words, the world is becoming more pluralistic, and within that, the West, the political West, needs to understand it's got an important part to play. I think it still has. Leadership of the United States is important, but it should be done with a sense of tragedy. Robert Kaplan's great book, which shows us, often in international politics, the choices between the two different types of good.
Yes, I mean, I think part of the problem is that, as various cultural commentators have said, America, but now Europe as well, I think, as the memories of the Second World War and European history have faded, we're not good at an appreciation of tragedy. We instead we have started telling ourselves what are not fairy tale is perhaps too unkind, but somebody said, like Star Wars, a world of goodies and baddies with all good on one side and all bad on the other. Well, it must be said, later Star Wars episodes, spin-offs, which I've been watching with my kids, are actually more sophisticated than that. But yes, I mean, this reduction of the world to, black and white, the dark side and the good side and so forth, does not exactly help. But you mentioned India. I remember years ago an Indian diplomat saying, we want partnership with the US, but we will never enter into a full alliance with the US. And one reason is that India is an independent great power and a superpower of the future. And we are not going to be, subordinate allies or client states of anybody. And America, he said, can only understand an alliance with the US in terms of subordination, and he said, India is not Denmark. We don't do that. We will defend our own, what we regard as our vital interests and pursue them, and if that accords with what America wants, great. But if it doesn't, well, it doesn't. We go our own way. Why do you think is it that countries like France and Germany have been willing to continue, mostly with some exceptions, but this really completely subordinate relationship after the Cold War, when, objectively speaking, so many of the reasons for it seem to have disappeared?
Yeah, no, that's a fundamental issue. At the end of the Cold War, we all assumed, I certainly wanted it as well, that we would have a pan-continental vision, that finally Europe would achieve that unity from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Of course, the European Union did a massive achievement in reconciling France and Germany. It was impossible for them to go to war. And I said immediately after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that the big challenge now, the biggest one, finally, let's step up to the plate, and that is to ensure that Russia and all the successor Soviet states are brought in to a comfortable, cooperative order. Unfortunately, of course, the tension between Atlanticism and pan-continentalism or Gaullism and so on became intensified. And we have this obsession with the unity of the Atlantic power system, the political West, as I call it. And this emphasis on unity is what has ultimately done what some people call the vassalization of France and Germany. I very much laud the way that both Olaf Scholz in Germany and Macron before the war in Ukraine went to Moscow, tried to act as peace dealers, but they had no traction. Decisions were taken in Washington. And this was a stark reminder of the marginalization of Europe as a power of any sort, even as a normative one, because we could see it really hasn't made any contribution in any discussion of peace discussions in the Middle East or in Ukraine or further. In fact, it's exacerbated it. It has that logic of competition, the bloc politics logic, even though they denied it. They said, we don't do bloc politics, we don't do spheres of interests. But what was a European partnership if it wasn't an extension of it? And unfortunately, we see the effective merge. Of course, there's differences between the EU and NATO. That's the answer. I mean, that's what's happened. Can I just say one other point on India? You mentioned China. That when they say this, what they're saying is that we're going to have a different type of politics. China says that they don't do bloc politics, they don't do alliances. India will be friends, but it won't build up, one of these military alliances where the United States, of course, as a legacy of the first Cold War, has intensified that into the second Cold War, which of course is part of the cause for this conflict, which we see today. So they're offering an alternative way of doing international politics. They've got many flaws, we all know that, but that's what they're offering at the international political level. And I think it's hugely important. That's why many people look to the so-called Global South today as a source of rationality and peacemaking. And of course, we had delegations, even especially marvelously from Africa, trying to deal with European problems. And it's a very interesting, this war, which is an extraordinary turnaround that you could say worse, the global north, once again, it's got this obsessive tendency to fall into war endlessly. So the global north really is, shooting itself in the foot. Blowback is going to be massive. And the future lies with the states who can try to avoid being sucked into this maelstrom of endless conflict. It's not just war, it's also the propaganda, the cultural homogeneity which is imposed even on academic life today. As you mentioned, we're dissidents in many ways, not because we are opposed to the values of the West. We're not. I'm certainly not. But I want a different West to emerge, a better West.
Here, here. It always seemed to me that, part of the problem was that, and here perhaps also an element of tragedy, because the expansion of the European Union to Eastern Europe, with all its considerable ambiguities and flaws, was still a tremendous success story. But given that the integration of Russia into the European Union was almost impossible, rationally speaking. The problem was that as soon as you started, which I saw from very early on, simply defining the European Union as Europe, at that point, that implicitly excluded Russia from Europe. And then when people started talking about Europe whole and free, including Ukraine, and at that point, you have more or less designated Russia a non-European state, and in a way, the other, given the deep innate tendencies to define Europe as civilization and everything else as barbarism. And that, of course, was deeply demoralizing and caused great anger. Not just in establishment Russians, but many liberal Russians as well. Kozyrev warned of this, way back, excluding Russia in this fashion. But was there any way to reconcile the expansion of the European Union with a cooperative, inclusive economic relationship with Europe, in your view? I'm sorry, not Europe, the European Union, I should say. Slipped into it myself.
At the beginning, at the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union, clearly Russia was a bit of a basket case at that stage, and so it could be what they thought safely ignored. But even at that stage, and we'd always said the amazing absence of creative thinking, of innovative institutional engineering. So basically, the West hijacked the end of the Cold War to say, look, it's our victory. So we're moving towards simply expansion of a tried and tested system, which worked. Yeah, fine. So we just need to expand it, enlarge it. Whereas the Russians were saying, look, we need transformation. And funnily enough, there's two levels to that. On the economic, you said European Union. This is where the Gaullist line comes in. And Mitterrand mentioned it. We all talked in the early 90s, right from the start, when precisely Yeltsin and Andrei Kozyrev, his foreign minister, were talking of a cold peace, that we need to establish some overarching body, a confederation of Europe, as the way Francois Mitterrand put it, which would have meant the European Union could do its thing, which is intense regulation and so on, all very good, and but within a larger framework, what today Macron would talk about European political community, which of course, unfortunately, excludes precisely the bodies that 30 years ago, which would have been a framework to put them in, Belarus and Russia. And of course, the second enlarging issue was NATO, which we've talked about and ad nauseam. But let me just say one point on that. Going back to, and I mentioned it in the book, Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard of 1997. I was astonished because I hadn't remembered this from years back, that he actually argued, a passionate advocate of NATO enlargement. But he did say in this book, but of course, we have to establish an overarching security framework for Moscow so it doesn't feel excluded. But of course, that second leg of NATO enlargement was totally forgotten. And when Putin came to power in the year 2000, he constantly said, of course, we're facing this, imminent security dilemma. Let Russia join NATO. Okay, it won't be immediate. It would be a long term. It would be a movement towards some sort of genuine collective security, because NATO ultimately turned out to be a collective defense body and not a collective security body. Because as collective defense, therefore, by definition, it was opposed to Russia. And then we get to where we are today, which is this very new Iron Curtain dividing the continent.
We have two questions inevitably about Putin's agency. First, would things have been different if he had left the scene 10 years ago, say, before 2014? Or in the end, are certain attitudes and policies baked into the entire Russian establishment and, no other leader would have pursued a different policy? And secondly, of course, direct responsibility for the Ukraine war. In the end, Putin made the decision to invade. Does that not leave the overwhelming moral responsibility for this disaster, with him?
Yeah. On the first point, it's a fascinating counterfactual, and there's some marvelous discussions of how the Putin evolved. He came to power in 2000, and I believe it was the case, even though he was a child of his times and of his culture. But nevertheless, he was the most pro-Western leader Russia has ever had, genuinely one from St. Petersburg. And gradually, the disillusionment set in to the point of utter alienation. And of course, this was a common feeling with a lot of the elite, and that was the price to pay for a relatively bloodless transition from the Soviet Union to post-communist, post-Soviet Russia. So the more likely option, if it wasn't Putin, who is endlessly criticized, as you know, by the more radical nationalists and hardliners, as being a softie, because Putin is, his whole way of managing of statecraft is to balance these competing interests. For example, he's allowed the economic liberals to dominate on the economic sphere, for which he's much criticized. We're talking about the Central Bank of Russia, headed by Vera Nabiullina, Kudrin until recently, others, I won't mention them all, but you know who these are, these economic liberals who have governed macroeconomic policy, and so on. We could go through the whole list. So basically, the bottom line is that without Putin, it's quite likely that a much tougher and much more hardline person would have come to power, because even the liberals, are important, but relatively marginal in electoral terms. So Zhirinovsky, of course, is dead now, but would have been a possibility. As for direct responsibility for the invasion, yes, indeed, the actual invasion clearly, the United Nations Charter does allow the right of self-defense of Article 51 and others implicitly. Clearly, the act lies and responsibility must lie with Moscow and Putin personally. However, the argument that the invasion was unprovoked is completely false. There's a long, long history. We're talking about it now, of course. This 30-year-long failure to build an inclusive security order after the end of the First Cold War, how we slipped into a second Cold War, how Russia was isolated from European security community. And then, of course, we could look at the developments within Ukraine itself, which in particular in the last months, it seemed almost as if Washington was deliberately provoking Moscow. And I'll give one incident now, which I've recently learnt. I won't name the name who told me, but one incident which really helped precipitate this decision, which of course I'm against war, is the when the British ship HMS Defender, if I'm not mistaken, in June 2021 clipped Russian claimed waters around Sevastopol. You may remember the incident. I've been told by people within the system, within the Kremlin, who say that Putin was absolutely furious by that. That in a sense, the decision was taken, I mean, it wasn't a final decision, in June 2021, when the British, and of course, they then signed this defense pact with Ukraine, and they were arming it, it seemed from Moscow's perspective, arming it to the teeth, as an anti-Russia, and as a Platzdarm, what do you call it, a bastion for anti-Russianism. And of course, the autumn of 2021, the United States signed a security agreement with Ukraine. NATO membership wasn't on the cards imminently, but the security partnership was, and the arming of Ukraine. So I think that clearly it was, as I'm working on a book now called The March of Folly Resumed. All sides, Kiev, Washington, London, Moscow, all were, but how can I put it, consumed by folly. And the term obviously comes from Barbara Tuchman, marvelous book, The March of Folly, from the Peloponnesian War to Vietnam. And it's exactly another case of folly, on all sides.
And yet, I mean, the British also exemplify the fact that there was an element of the theatrical about all this. Actual British military aid to Ukraine has been, since the beginning of the war, I mean, certain things very useful, but in terms of Ukraine's needs, I mean, vastly inadequate, because actually the British do not have the military industries which can produce, the munition, especially, which Ukraine needs, or the tanks, or the spare parts, or anything. And of course, when Zelensky went to London and other capitals before the war, as he has said himself, and asked if they could guarantee that Ukraine would be in NATO within 5 years, they all said no. The British government said no publicly, no, not going to happen. So there was this strange disconnect between the rhetorical grandstanding and the actual Western commitment, which I still find bizarre. Because, of course, there was never a chance that the British Navy was going to deploy in the Black Sea to fight Russia.
No.
What happened to us there, this divorce between rhetoric and reality?
Yeah. One has to say that in recent years, and this is transcending any political party, the British politics has become more and more performative. It seems to be, as you say, a show. It doesn't. We're not well governed. I think that's accepted across the board nowadays, and it's done for show, indeed. And that returns to an earlier point you mentioned about. Did you mention? The films you've been seeing recently, and I've been talking about the Marvel universe, the Marvel films, which and the latest ones in particular, but in general, in a Marvel comic and film nowadays, you have the sort of the baddie, the evil one, suddenly emerges fully fledged. No sense of the backstory and the context, and indeed decontextualization seems to be the name of the game now. And that, I suppose, reflects the other issue, which you said, on the one side, you've got this sort of postmodern state, United Kingdom with a rather, very important, but still not much more than 70,000 troops under arms at the moment, which, down endless cuts. So against Russia, which is still an old-fashioned, traditional, high modern, modernist state which has not deindustrialized. Anybody could have told you it's got vast industrial plants, which now, of course, churning out weapons for this war. We don't anymore, and we've seen the difficulties in getting the 155 millimeter shells, and we've had to go to South Korea, and Russia, of course, got some more from North Korea. But it's the incommensurability of it, and of course this sense that time is it's timelessness of it all, as you say, this theatricality. It's all done for show, and obviously the governments of Boris Johnson, by definition, he's a showman. He's some people would use nastier words, but definitely, flamboyant, which is one of his great attractions to the populace earlier. But of course, when it comes to actually governing and policy, it's for show and short-term advantage rather than a long-term strategy. And that's where the West, of course, has over the years lost its way to have a, and we don't have serious leaders who have this long-term vision. I'm thinking of a de Gaulle. I'm thinking of Harold Macmillan, even in the Harold Wilson, my great hero, was one of those. These people, this generation of leaders today, and especially in Germany, one has to say it, and Macron says the right things if you catch him before lunch, but after lunch he says something very different. And of course, by the evening, it's a third thing. There's no consistency, no real commitment to following through on a peace agenda, a reconciliation agenda, or any agenda.
Yeah. Well, it has struck me so much, of course, especially in Germany, but France too. You cannot expect, in many ways, a transatlantic banker to have the same commitment, ideas, sense of history as somebody who was wounded at Verdun,
Yeah.
And lived through the Second World War. I mean, the change in the German establishment is absolutely extraordinary. I always remember how I interviewed Helmut Schmidt many years ago, after he'd retired, of course, but he kept coming back to his experience in the Second World War and how this must never be repeated, and the sense of responsibility this must give to every German, which clearly somebody like Annalena Baerbock does not share in any way. When it comes to Ukraine, I mean, the one major European effort, which of course came to nothing but seemed hopeful at the time, was of course the Minsk agreement on the Donbass. Now, since then, the two European leaders, chiefly responsible, Merkel and Hollande, have claimed that basically this was all a deliberate trick, that they never had any intention of really implementing Minsk or getting the Ukrainians to implement it, and it's basically just to give the Ukrainians time to arm themselves, to defend themselves against Russia. How do you read Minsk? I mean, what are they? Were they lying at the time, or are they lying now? Was it in fact a serious effort, and could it have worked to prevent this present war?
Yeah, well, for Minsk, obviously we're talking about Minsk 2 of February 2015, yes, which was basically a staged return of the two territories to Ukrainian sovereignty. I actually believe it did offer a pathway, but the underlying question then becomes, in the early phase, and this is where we have to talk about the agency of the Donbass people themselves. I think the general consensus today, outside Ukraine, of course, is the fact that in the early stages, we're talking about after the events, the overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014, into maybe well into 2015, that this was a genuine, with Russian intervention, yes, on two major occasions, a civil war. I know that this is highly controversial, but still, I think that the best books, and I've just read the marvelous book by Dominic O'Rell and Jesse Driscoll, who do argue, these are people who are not, by any stretch of the imagination, Russophiles, but balanced, excellent scholars. And they argue quite clearly it was a civil war, but you have to stage it. And gradually, of course, it became more and more of an interstate war. But ultimately, the subjectivity of the Donbass insurgency, they weren't separatists at first even, they were autonomists. They wanted autonomy. And Minsk did address that. Now, we know that Kiev didn't want to implement it because it felt as if it was an imposed structure on it. And we know that then the right-wing forces within Ukraine, the so-called anti-capitulationists, supported by Western cheerleaders, I think mistakenly, uh, uh, had no intention of fulfilling it and considered it, disaster. And when Zelensky, of course, was elected as the peace candidate in April 2019 with 73% of the vote in his first months, rather half-heartedly, but nevertheless, he did try to, talk about this within the framework of the so-called Steinmeier formula. So I mean, but even if Minsk wasn't going to be able to be implemented, at least then I think the Western powers should have accepted it and said, okay, well, what's the alternative? What's the framework to overcome it? So it was the worst. This dishonesty of Merkel and Hollande, who later said they had no intention of implementing it, is doubly catastrophic. Not only did they insist, did this mean that you had these sanctions endlessly imposed on Russia for not fulfilling something that they had no intention of fulfilling themselves, and put no pressure on Ukrainian authorities to do so. So it's, not only a question of bad faith, it's a question of bad politics, bad statesmanship. And of course, it's disgraceful that afterwards they said, well, we never intended to do so, which is rather shameless. And I think in the annals of history, one of the few times that leaders will admit that they deceived a major competitor, a nuclear armed power in Moscow. It's so bizarre, this whole story. And so I'm glad you mention it, that it's just so bizarre at all levels. And of course, this is the sort of thinking which led to this war, this sort of confused and dishonest and shabby politicking, short-termism that, some of us, you, me, others, we've been warning for a long time that the situation was maturing into a crisis, which, Putin, decided the only way to resolve it was an invasion, which is absolutely catastrophic and awful in all levels. I mean, absolutely. But it was a crisis, was genuine, so it wasn't of his making, though it was not sure what the alternatives from Moscow's perspective they had at that time. And there were, I think. I mean, I think diplomacy would, you keep pushing at diplomacy door, obviously, would have been the alternative.
I remember when I came to Washington in spring of 2021 after the Biden administration took office, and U.S. officials by then and sort of establishment commentators were also saying, at least in private, Minsk is dead. The Minsk agreement is dead. There's no future for the Minsk agreement. But when you asked, so what's the alternative? I mean, if there's no Minsk agreement and nothing else is minimally acceptable to Russia, what are you advocating? I mean, a new war? And to that, they had no answer. I don't think they were advocating a new war, but they had no idea of what else to do, nor did they appear to feel any responsibility to come up with, with alternative policies.
I wonder whether that was generated by the sense that they felt Moscow and Russia was far weaker than it actually turned out to be. That ultimately, clearly, by then, Putin was being demonized, and diplomacy effectively with Russia had come to a complete halt, especially as visible in the two security treaties which Moscow put forwards in December 2021. And, the sense when in the early language that, we have to weaken Russia, that Bruno Le Maire, the French finance minister, says that we'll, turn the Russian economy to rubble, and all of that sort of language was shockingly hubristic and catastrophic, because I think they underestimated the state capacity, the industrial capacity, and indeed the political consensus which governs Russia. Of course, it's not universal, and plenty of people oppose the war, but I think that every Russian I've met in the last months, and I've traveled a few times in the last couple of years, deep down, no one is enthusiastic about the war. I mean, apart from the ultra nationalists and so on, no one wants this war. No one. And so, and the latest opinion polls show that they support Putin. 80% support Putin, but they also support to find a way to put an end to this. But as you say, the irresponsibility of the Western leadership over the last few years is, I think, one of the striking phenomena of our time. And this is across the board and across political parties.
Yes, I mean, my perception from also, of course, talking to many Russians is indeed the great majority would not have gone to war themselves. They didn't want this war.
No,
But of course, now that they're in it, they also do not want to suffer a catastrophic and humiliating defeat.
absolutely.
And that's not particularly surprising. I know American soldiers who really did not want to go into Iraq. That wasn't their decision, but once you're in it, you don't want to, at least you don't want to lose in a completely disastrous and open fashion. Now, on that score, I mean, a question: can you? What do you think about more limited ways forward of trying to begin to restore the relationship? I mean, arms control agreements, at least nuclear arms control agreements, the Arctic, where I mean, I've been quite somebody who is acutely interested in and aware of the issue of climate change, appalled by the idea that the biggest threat to US interests in the Arctic comes from Russian or Chinese ships being able to sail around a bit more, rather than the effect on climate change of the melting of the ice cap and the permafrost. But since Russia, by definition, cannot be excluded from Arctic discussions as the biggest Arctic state by far, are discussions on issues like that a way of beginning to restore some form of what we used to call détente between the West and Russia? Is there any hope for this?
If you remember, when Gorbachev put an end to the first Cold War, the word used all the time was building trust and trust building. And at the end of, and in the last decade or two of the end of the first Cold War, there was trust building, and and this was done by citizens diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, academic exchanges, all of that gradually. So détente wasn't just one event, but it was a whole network of things. All of that dismantled today. This second Cold War, and that's why I call it a Cold War, is far worse, far deeper than the first one, and in part because of its very amorphous character. The first one, we knew it was communism versus capitalism, roughly speaking. Today, they attempt to try to shoehorn it into a democracy versus autocracy labels really doesn't really wash as such, because we have our difficulties, they have their difficulties, and of course it's on that
we have our autocratic client states
indeed as well. So it's the whole thing is gone. So there's four big challenges why I say we need to move towards a positive peace agenda. You mentioned there's obviously global heating, climate change, which of course is 4 or 5 times faster in the Arctic than it is elsewhere, with a danger of not only massive methane release, but also of possibly unknown pathogens which have been hidden under the permafrost for maybe tens of thousands of years, against which humans have no defense. So that's the climate change. There's also, of course, biodiversity collapse. I mean, just look at it, the number of birds and so on. The third thing is worldwide toxification, for example, plastic in the sea and all its effect. And fourthly, as you say, nuclear war. 4 big issues, far more, overwhelming, facing humanity today, which only a positive peace agenda could address. So it's not, an abstract utopian dream. It's a physical, political, intellectual necessity to work to find a way forwards. And as you say, how to do it is, first of all, stepping back. It's both Moscow, Washington, because that's the real players in this, both have to step back and, start. There's already feelers out there, I think, in the back channels. And, one person who, could possibly take the lead in this is William Burns, at the head of the CIA now. He did that really good book as former US ambassador to Russia. And, he understands Russia, though lately, maybe it's because of his position, his Ditchley Park speech last year and so on were quite militant, but still he's an experienced diplomat. And I think that in the US administration today, I don't mean people like Blinken or Jake Sullivan, who I don't think, and of course Biden himself, who are virulently unable to understand the perspective of Moscow, which is very strange. These people have been engaged, and certainly Biden, in diplomacy for years, yet he seems to be the most inept diplomat possibly who's ever led the United States.
Yes, I mean, I've often reflected on the truth of, Morgenthau's dictum that a principal ethical duty, and as well as a practical duty of the statesman, is what Atticus Finch says, of course, in To Kill a
Mm,
Mockingbird as well, is to cultivate the ability to place yourself in the shoes of your
mhm.
opposite numbers, not in order necessarily to agree with them, but to understand what is important to them, what is really important to them, on what they will compromise, on what they will not compromise, and then, of course, to work out essentially when compromise is possible and agreement, and when indeed the only option is confrontation. It's always seemed weird to me that with our huge think tank, apparatuses, what Eisenhower, I believe, in the first draft called the military industrial academic
Yeah,
complex, that this capacity for cultivating empathy seems to be remarkably limited. There is a question about this with regard to RussiaGate. I mean, to what extent is this now something that is being enforced in the West? An ideological conformism which excludes the possibility even of serious study of the adversary, and in which essentially propaganda lines without factual support become accepted facts, which it's then impossible ever to get rid of again with evidence or argument.
absolutely. That empathy does not mean sympathy. As you say, empathy
Yeah,
is precisely putting yourself in the shoes of others. And of course, we as academics, that's our job, is to try to understand the logic of behavior. It doesn't mean endorsing that logic, it means understanding it. Whereas, of course, this then spills over into the diplomatic world, where diplomatic engagement, is considered to be giving legitimacy to the adversary, which is a bizarre way of thinking about it, because the whole point of diplomacy is you talk to people with whom you don't agree. Otherwise, there's no point to it. And as for RussiaGate, this really is the beginning, if you like, of the collapse, because RussiaGate, the idea that Trump and Putin colluded in some substantive way in 2015, 2016, and helped get Trump elected. There's not a shred of evidence to that effect. Yes, Russia was poking about in just like the United States is. This is what states do. And of course, they had the a few tweets and such like, which were minimal. So the RussiaGate deception is what people, maybe I don't fully endorse this view, but it was certainly, its effect was to make impossible Trump's vision. His fantastic Mayflower speech in 2016, in which he said it makes sense to get on with Russia. And he was absolutely right on that view. It does make sense. And of course, that alarmed I'm not sure, the military industrialists and so on. And of course, we saw at the Democratic National Convention in July 2016, where Jake Sullivan was one of the architects of the Russiagate deception, going around to say that there was this collusion, and of course then played up the Christopher Steele dodgy dossier about all of this alleged malfeasance and behavior, which is complete fiction, as we now have discovered. All of this being played up, and of course the very strangely, all of the FBI and all of this, James Comey, who assumed that Hillary Clinton would win. So there's so much to this story, but the bottom line is that it consolidated a Cold War mentality in Washington and a McCarthyite mentality that any discussion, that Moscow became toxic, and to a point at which it's so toxic today, then there was no diplomacy when it came to as the Ukrainian crisis matured. There was no ability to talk. So, it sort of spiraled out of control. You ask, how can we stop this? How can we start to reverse it? I think that, discussions like this, we can begin to analyze how we got into the position. Well, that's the first step, to analyze where we are. And then on that basis, we can begin to move forwards. And I stress again that I think a return and a commitment to making the United Nations work to work better, not to say well, maybe as intended. In other words, the United Nations has become simply today a forum for the amplification of conflict. It should now return to being a forum for the resolution. So that's certainly the first step. Return and restore diplomacy, rebuild the diplomatic infrastructure, allow diplomats back to work, give back those consulates in St. Petersburg and Seattle and elsewhere in the United States. That would be huge, confidence building measures, as well as arms control, and indeed work together on climate change and those other issues we talked about.
But is any of this possible without peace in Ukraine? Obviously, we have several questions. I mean, given that the war seems to be heading, well, it seems to be in a stalemate, and time, according to many analysts, appears to be on Russia's side. I mean, is there a possibility now for a compromise peace in Ukraine? How do you see this? And is it possible now? Will it be possible in future?
Well, as we know, President Zelensky issued a decree which banned negotiation, which is again, one of the more bizarre features, in world history, that you preclude the possibility of putting an end to a conflict which is devastating your country, destroying your people, and undermining economy. That, I mean, of course, where there's a will, there's a way. So yes, you say, is it possible to have a compromise solution? Well, that's the only way forwards ultimately. To go back to the early ideas which were on the table in March and April 2022. Neutrality for Ukraine, some sort of bracketing of the territorial issues, because as Putin said at Valda, whether you take him at face value or not is a question of judgment, but certainly he said it's not a question of territory, it's a question of security. So that big issue which we talked about earlier has to be resolved, and that is clearly security for Ukraine. Of course, we all want to see a sovereign, democratic, flourishing Ukraine. I mean, that's given. But at the same time, that means everybody has to step back from their maximalist positions. And you mentioned stalemate on the front lines. As you say, more and more commentary suggests it's far from a stalemate, that Russia's building up its military potential. It's got, it's deployed, many on the front line, but a huge reserve army. So at a certain point, unless the West, and of course, one of the factors determining the timetable for any discussions, we know that Washington is calling for, behind the scenes for some sort of negotiation, is of course the timetable for the U.S. presidential elections next year. And of course, everybody's banking on some sort of possible change after November 2024.
Yes, I mean, if of course it's possible to kick the can down the road that far, the elections are almost, a year from now, or
Yeah.
more than a year from now.
Well,
Sorry,
exactly.
less
Yeah,
than a
it's
year from now.
meant to be. I think the 5th of November 2024.
That's
Yeah.
right. But then, of course, the formation of the new U.S. administration will always
Yeah.
take, more time than that.
Yeah.
I worry that we may not have that much time.
No.
Um,
No, that's true. Absolutely. It's unless there's going to be a major battlefield breakthrough, and of course the Ukrainian counteroffensive from June was designed to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position. If you remember, Mark Milley, chief of the U.S. General Staff, last autumn said, this is about as good as it gets after Kharkov.
Yeah.
Let's start the negotiations. They then had this counteroffensive. It's failed. I mean, there's no question it's failed. I mean, the fighting continues. And Russia's pushing forwards at today now at well, up at Kumyansk and another various places. Slowly, but slowly, and then suddenly, maybe fast. Who knows? There's a whole army waiting on the other side. Where the Sumy Kharkov gap, could push on to Kiev suddenly. I mean, I'm not a military person, but there's talk of it.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me a key problem is that in many ways, Russia's extreme weakness of the 1990s was held by many people to be permanent. And so basically you could do what you liked with regard to Russia. There was no possibility of pushback. But Russia's initial failures in this war, which were pretty striking at the start, dreadful failures of intelligence, military planning, military strategy, but they were then assumed, and logistics, but they were then assumed by too many Western military analysts to be permanent. So once again, they took a snapshot and thought that, and they ignored the underlying economic and military realities, unfortunately. Well, Richard, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating, though not terribly cheerful discussion, but then I don't think we expected this. And I urge you all to buy, indeed, Richard's new book, The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. Thank you all for coming, for attending, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. And Richard, congratulations once again on the book, and thank you for coming today.